Hello, art historians. And before we move into the next part of our lectures, where we're going to start looking at actual African art, so not necessarily architecture, but art, it's important to remember a couple key elements that define African art, all right? So the first thing is that African artists are not concerned with naturalism, and that is something you guys have to remember. Never really are they trying to make something look like an actual person or an actual object or make it look naturalistic. They believe that it is more important to convey an idea of something. That is what is much more important to them. So, like, even with the masks that we will look at, they don't really represent a specific person, but they represent ideas about that person or what the ideal person should be. Another important part of this is you'll see works of art that are very luminous. And what I mean by that is they're generally very polished, or they're made of materials that have a shine to it. Because the idea being that if you're talking about a perfect person, then the material should be perfect. It shouldn't be rough. It should be smooth and ideal and perfect. Another big thing with this is these artworks are meant to convey a purpose, almost like Egypt that we would see, that they really weren't meant for decorative purposes. So a very major idea for them is youthfulness and fertility and the continuation of these cultures and these tribes. Generally, whenever you see facial representations, you would think that masks would be scary or intimidating, but they're not. They're actually very reserved, with like downcast eyes or closed eyes, meaning they're in control. They're very reflective. But if their eyes are, for example, bulging, coming out, that could actually mean something else. It's not that they're trying to show a person with bulging eyes. They're using bulging eyes to show an idea about that person. You will also see a lot of stylization with African art, where some things are deliberately bigger or deliberately smaller because it's representing an idea. Why would you make the head bigger? Why would you make the feet bigger? And we're also going to see that sometimes the forms would be stretched or elongated. So kind of like we saw with Ingres, with the Grand Odalisque, where her body parts are not perfect. Well, sometimes beauty lies in imperfections, and this system of sex slavery is flawed, just like her body was flawed and not perfect. So it's very much like that. Like these works of art, if it's long, it's for a reason. If it's short, it's for a reason. If it's in, geometric proportions, it's for a reason. It's not meant to represent an actual person or an actual thing. It's meant to represent an idea. So, moving past where we talked about the time of Islam coming into Africa, we see Africa enter what is the medieval age. And we're really kind of going by that because this is a middle time period for Africa. But unlike Europe, where the Middle Ages is considered the Dark Ages, this was kind of Africa's golden age. This is when they were really blooming, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, below the Sahara Desert on the west coast, where we saw these cultures, these city-states, these kingdoms that were rising up in control of the gold trade on this area. So we start to see, as these areas become wealthier, we see the rising up of these very powerful kings to control this area, and they're going to use art to represent that particular power. And while they would have palaces, they can't be these massive, huge palaces that we would see in Europe, like in Versailles. They just don't have the space, number one, and they don't have the material to build that big. So a lot of the times, art could be used as decoration of architecture to kind of convey what the architecture can't in size. So one of the first kingdoms to really do this that was non-Islamic, that just completely rose up on their own without adopting Islam, was the Ife kingdom. So remember, a lot of this part of Africa would convert to Islam, because if they're going to be involved in trade, Islamic Sharia law already has in place a lot of rules for trade because the Arabs were traders by nature. So it was just easier to adopt the religion to govern the trade. But not everybody in this area did that, especially the Ife kingdom and Benin that you can see that are down here a little bit off the Sahara trade route, just a little bit, all right? So these two cultures, the Ife and the Benin, are going to be very influential in kind of being the mother culture to other non-Islamic African cultures. So kind of like the Olmec are to the Americas, where they were kind of the standard setters, like for example, the jaguar worship and things like that. We're going to see that kind of them setting the style for the rest of Africa in this particular area. And this was actually considered, just like China considered themselves the center of the world, they believe this is the center of the world where their right to rule began. And just like other places, they're going to draw on religion to do that, to kind of justify their rule. So the Ife artists in this area are a little bit notable because they have a style of art that Europeans consider to be way more naturalized than other African art. Now, I'm not going to say that like this was, natural in the way that the Greeks would do it, where it was almost so perfect it's not possible. But at one point, the people from Europe who encountered the Ife kingdom, when they saw the art, they're like, wow, did the Greeks get down here? Because you guys seem to be pretty good at art. Did somebody else teach you that? And it really just kind of shows European white mentality that nobody could do things as good as Europe did. Somebody from Europe had to actually have taught them how to do it, all right? So in 1300, we get an Ife prince who founds this city of Benin. And that little city actually starts to become an empire. Not a huge one, but definitely more advanced than we even saw in other empires. And that Ife style of naturalized art kind of went with him because he was an Ife prince. All right. So the way that the Ife were creating their art really kind of influenced this. But even what Europeans would consider naturalized wasn't that naturalized in African art. It just was more than, let's say, other African cultures that they saw. And the first prince or king of the Benin kingdom became the Oba, all right? And the Oba is going to use art as a way to reinforce his rule. He can't do it through a massive palace, but he can do it through particular art that they create. And the art that we're going to look at really represents two different types of interactions with the Europeans. One that was kind of positive and one that was pretty negative. And to this day, this area is still ruled by the Obas. All right. So just to show you guys, this is an Ife mask, not Benin, it is Ife. And this is what the Europeans looked at and were like, wow, did the Greeks get down here and teach you guys that? And these guys were like, no, we just actually know how to do these things. And they were able to use the materials around them like terracotta and bronze to be able to create this type of art. But the people from Europe were like, wow, it's so good. Did you guys learn from Europeans? Which is kind of insulting if you think of it that way. So another example here, you can see where it actually was a little bit more naturalized than what you would typically see. So this is the work of art. This is one of the Benin brass plaques. So there's a common misconception because of the color that these are bronze, but it actually was done in brass, which was brass that they actually got from trading with the Portuguese. And they used this brass to create these plaques that they put on posts throughout this palace as a way to demonstrate visually the power of the Oba, right, of Oba's palace, because that's what these were meant for. Now, in terms of naturalism, yeah, okay. You can definitely tell what it is. So that's a little bit of that Ife influence. But still, we can see that use of hierarchy of scale here, all right? So for example, you've got this person, this center person, who is obviously bigger than the others, right? Which shows his importance. And he's sitting on a horse, which is much, much smaller than he is, to show that he kind of conquers over the beasts at the time. He's got his servants who are holding palm leaves or fans over him, which is something that only the Oba would have gotten to do. And then you see, if you look in here, his servants are much smaller. Now, there's people who hypothesize those are children so that they could naturally show his status. And that may be because they were a little bit more naturalized. But you can see that compared even to the servants on the side, he is much bigger, even much bigger than the horse. Now, if you look closer, you can see that in the background, it looks like they have put into this, imprinted into it, crosses, which they may have viewed as pretty decoration because the Portuguese, who they interacted with through trade, the Portuguese were the first people to interact with the Benin Kingdom, that they may have liked the design of the crosses. So they put those on here as maybe tribute to the Portuguese, or they just like the design of it. But the brass that they used to this used for this came from trading with the Portuguese. All right. So the wooden columns in Oba's palace were decorated with these brass plaques. And in terms of naturalization, where something would naturally look, it's not bad. Like it's not completely off. All right. The smaller page boys, again, may have meant to show that he is bigger, but again, he's also bigger than the people off to the side as well. He was also shown in this holding ivory tusks, and elephants are considered wise because they never forget, which is actually true because they have an enlarged hippocampus. So they remember things longer, and they also feel emotion very strongly. So they tend to remember things a lot better. So elephants are considered wise. So putting into here elephant tusks and the leopard masks. Leopards were the royal symbol. So you either have leopard or you have lion, right? And that is kind of like the symbol of power, whereas it's jaguars over in the Americas. It's the leopard here. A horse, which is something they would have gotten from Islam, not or the Arabic world, because the Arabians had the best horses. This does show power because not everybody could have a horse. Like that was a huge status symbol, but he's even bigger than the horse, right? So they're showing you ideas. They're showing him his power not only through his size, but also through the fact that there are symbols in here that represent his particular power. Now, if you look very closely, you'll see around his neck, it looks like he has rings. And those would be in this kind of pinkish red coral necklaces. And these were not from Africa. They were actually from Portugal that the Portuguese brought down. And so it was only allowed that the Oba could wear the coral, all right, which was considered a gift from the sea. But it's also got deeper meaning to that because you can see he wears a lot of those rings, which was to represent this idea that this is a heavy burden that he wears. Like as king, this is not easy. It's not like he's dripping in gold and diamonds. He's wearing something very heavy because this is a heavy responsibility. And the red color of that was showed that he has the ability and the right to shed blood to protect his kingdom. So everything in here was symbolic about this, all right, that he is such a huge deal representing in what's happening in this, not only his size, but the symbolism in it, all right? So the Portuguese were huge influence on this. And at first, this was not a bad relationship because a lot was gained by the Portuguese coming in and trading with the Benin. Like it wasn't necessarily a bad relationship. And you can see here on the right that, they were actually put like the hats here and like the stuff that they're holding in the sword. That's a Portuguese man being shown here with fish next to him because the Portuguese were kind of a symbol of trade and the Benin Oba made that possible. Like he was doing that. But in addition to this, the Oba controlled the art as part of his power, as far as what could be done, what could be shown, who could have artwork like this, who could create artwork for the king. And I think this is really funny that they've got here. I just found this recently that on the side here is mudfish because mudfish can actually come out of the water and breathe on land. So you've got an animal that's comfortable with land and water. And that was kind of representative to the Portuguese because they came on water and then they were comfortable on the land as well. So just like we've seen in other cultures, this was not like if you went up to Titian and went, "Hey, what are you painting?" He's like, "I'm painting a woman, a nude woman that, this is supposed to teach her something," right? They're painting a much bigger idea. They're creating they're basically sculpting royalty and showing what royalty looks like through the symbols they included. All right, so you can see here the details of the little Portuguese crosses. And here's another one you can see here too, another one of the Benin plaques. So the Portuguese and the Benin got along just fine. There wasn't really a problem there. But eventually the Portuguese and the Spanish are going to lose their monopoly over trade in the Indian Ocean and the Americas. And it's not going to be long until the 1800s when the scramble for Africa begins and people start wanting to get their hands on these very wealthy areas. And Benin is definitely one of those areas with where it's located with its access to gold and things like that. And when the British came in, it was a much less friendly relationship. And in 1897, they launched a punitive expedition, which means this was meant to punish the Benin for not treating the British the way that they felt they should be treated. They overthrew the Oba, they sent him into exile, they burned down the palace, and they took the wall plaques. And the plaques have ended up all over the world. In fact, the Benin brasses, the St. Louis Art Museum has a piece of Benin brass. And the British by far have the #1 collection of the Benin plaques that they feel that they should have back. So the current Oba, like there are, you can see here, that red coral that he's wearing, he's got those many layers around his neck. This is a modern picture of the Oba. And you can see he's still wearing that reddish color, and he's still very active in African affairs. In fact, one of the things that he's passionate about is human trafficking, which does happen a lot out of these cultures. So another picture of a modern Oba. Okay, so when the European countries first start their second wave of coming into Africa, they really only stayed on the exterior part of it. And for a very important reason, they couldn't survive the diseases of going past like the coastline of Africa. So they really kind of stayed focused on areas like the Gold Coast and the Ivory Coast. So keyword here, coast. They could stay on the area or on the outsides. Eventually, this is going to change whenever the Industrial Revolution, one of the byproducts of that is going to be that they created vaccines. So now they will be able to fight against diseases like malaria and actually go into the heart of Africa and physically conquer it for themselves without having to depend on the tribal cultures to do it. Because what they would do is sometimes go to one tribe and be like, hey, we're going to give you guns and you're going to go force this tribe to get us this resource and you'll be more powerful over them, which is one of the reasons why we have genocides in Africa today because of that. So in 1885, Africa was divided up at the Scramble for Africa. Once these vaccines were available and better transportation was available, and European powers sat down in Berlin, Germany, carved up Africa like a turkey, and did not really care who they were splitting up or putting together because they could control it because they were there with weapons and, you know, these African cultures didn't have them. And they invited nobody from Africa to do this, all right? So there's going to be instances where art was at the heart of some of these conflicts between Africa and the Europeans, because the Africans very quickly, or the Europeans, excuse me, very quickly realized that to these Africans, this art wasn't just decorative. It was symbolic. It was important. It was a huge part of who they were. And these African artists were using that art to protect their powers, use them for religious beliefs of protection against them. And so Europeans very quickly figured out that this was a way to kind of kick their spirit out from underneath them, was to take the art that was at the heart of them. Kind of like in Latin America, whenever the Spanish tore down the Temple Mayor of the Aztecs, or they tore down Coricancha of the Incas, this was a statement. So one of the things that we have talked about with African art before is that, as we saw with the Mosque of Jenny, prior to this time, the Africans were very open to outsiders coming in because they were mainly coming in for trade, not for conquest. But now that Africa was under attack and that was very threatened, their art is going to be held onto. It's not really going to change a lot because they're trying to hold on to the cultural beliefs that they had and try to maintain this sense of original integrity. And what's ironic is that this art during this time is what people will typically consider as African art. And they'll say that this is very backwards and it shows that Africa wasn't that advanced because, oh my gosh, they're still using hierarchy of scale. They never changed. No, they're just holding on to their past to maintain that in the face of being threatened by outsiders. So this should show you right here what's really going to happen to Africa and how much they're going to carve it up. Britain was really focused on basically getting as much of it as they could. The area that we're talking about right here that they could get their hands on was the Ivory and Gold coasts, because those are huge resources. And then over here towards Africa, because they wanted the access to the Suez Canal, because that would give them easy access to their colonies in India. And of course, South Africa, which is where there was a great deal of diamonds. So Africa, Britain had their hand pretty much all over Africa. So Ghana is a very important part of Africa because Ghana was a very, very powerful kingdom while Britain was just running around beating each other with sticks. Like there was Africa with Ghana was this area that the name basically meant gold because this is one of those kingdoms that had risen up because of control of the not only slave trade but the gold trade with the Arabic traders, that they would trade gold and slaves and leopard skins and ivory in exchange for salt, which is kind of something that they really, really wanted that the Arabs could bring from the desert. So Ghana, to them, gold was this very sacred color because gold is literally what they were built on. But the catch was that only the king could have artwork that was covered in gold. It was kind of symbolic in itself that the king could have it. It's a status symbol. And they would even cover useful objects in gold, like even umbrellas, because they can, right? That was kind of the part of it. But by far, their most important work of art, right? And because they were Islamic, remember, they're not going to do in Ghana a lot of figural art. They're not going to have like the Benin wall plaques where it shows people. Ghana converted to Islam. So a lot of figural art where you're going to have decorative art. So you decorate everything. And in this case, in gold. And one very, very sacred work of art to the Ghana people was Sika Dwa Kofi, which is their golden stool. And this stool, as legend of Ashanti, because that's the people, the Ashanti people of Ghana, fell from the heavens and landed in the lap of the first true king, which basically said, I was blessed by the heavens, by this stool, and it was a very, very important thing to them in terms of this stool, and we'll explain why. So this was actually the seat of power, but it was such a powerful object in itself that it couldn't be sat on by anybody. It gets its own chair to sit on. So you can see where this is located, the Ashanti Kingdom in Ghana. That's what the British were going for. They wanted this area because of the ivory and gold that were in this area that were very precious to them during this time. All right. So goldsmiths could only create gold items if the chief or king agreed to it, the Santehana. Like he had to say that it was totally okay. He controlled the gold supply and what could be made of gold. And you can see here the Santehana with the golden stool sitting on its own chair. That's a modern picture, by the way.
We're at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology talking about the golden stool. We're actually going to be looking at several different objects to make sense of this very important object that we don't have in a collection. It still exists in the Ashanti Nation in Ghana.
It was incredibly important to the Ashanti people that that object remained in their possession, but that's a story we'll come back to. Let's talk about its origin.
In the early 1700s, a man named Ose Tutu, an important king, was able to unify all the surrounding lands.
He created the nation of the Ashanti people.
The golden stool falls from the sky and lands in the lap of Ose Tutu.
So this is a miracle.
Absolutely. And this is a wooden stool covered in gold, which was said to have been made in the heavens. It's said to be the soul of the Ashanti Nation. So it takes on the essence of the entire group in the same way that we'll see a man's stool or a woman's stool can take on the essence of that person.
So in a way, the stool is more important than any single king of the Ashanti people.
It is far more sacred than the Ashanti Hini himself. And in fact, the golden stool is always given its own stool or its own chair on which to sit next to the Ashanti Hini, like we see in this picture.
This is an area that is rich in gold, and the gold comes to symbolize royalty for the Ashanti people.
They were in charge of the gold trade through North Africa. This was long before Europeans were even there. But also gold is the color of royalty. So whether it's gold in the form of a textile color or it's the material of gold, it was reserved for royal use.
So let's look at the objects in this case that relate to the trading of gold.
We have a scale which shows how gold would have been weighed, and it would have been weighed with brass.
So you would use these on one side of a scale and measure out the gold on the other so that you knew you were measuring the accurate amount of gold.
What we find is a whole host of brass weights fashioned into very elaborate figures that depict almost every activity in every part of daily life.
So it's a really wonderful way to learn about the Ashanti people. We see two here that show images of the Ashanti king.
Both of these depict a group of figures gathered around a central umbrella. That umbrella is really important because underneath it we know is the Ashanti-hini, or an important chief.
So the umbrella was a way that you could identify the king in a crowd.
The king would also be wearing sandals, and we have a brass weight of just sandals depicted. And in that sense, we understand that the king is divine. In other words, he is seen as an intermediary between the everyday lives of his people and the supernatural realm. He's there to harness the good powers of the supernatural to help his people.
He's between the heavens, below the umbrella, but he is above the earth, symbolized by the sandals that he wears.
So he's always sandwiched between the two.
In one of these gold weights, we see the king surrounded by his retinue under an umbrella, being carried in a palanquin.
And surrounding him are his sword bearers. Swords are very important symbols of rule, and they would have had gold handles.
And then we see next to it another image of the king, this time with his wife, with the queen.
Could be the queen mother, it could be his wife. There's an umbrella, and then two sword bearers in front of him. We also have other brass weights that just depict one figure, and these relate to particular proverbs or stories about virtues. And here we get at this important part about Ashanti modes of communication. That is that you don't speak directly. If you can, you let art speak for you.
And you often speak in proverbs.
Yeah, so each one of these have messages. If you understand this language, if you can decode it, you can know what the messages are.
So one of the ones in the case shows two crocodiles sharing one stomach.
And this double-headed crocodile has to do with the idea of family sharing a stomach. In other words, your connection, your essence, your belly is connected to your family. That's who nurtures you. So if you go off on your own, you're really not going to get very far in life.
And then we have a goat.
Or a ram with these curved horns. And one proverb states that rams move back before they charge. So the idea is that you have thoughtful contemplation, you move away from what you're about to do to make sure it's the right path.
So we're looking at these gold weights, and that brings us to another important part of the history of the Ashanti people, the continuing involvement of the British.
The British, certainly since the early 19th century, were interested in securing a way to control gold in this area. And they named this area the Gold Coast. The Ashanti obviously were not wanting to give up their control of this precious material, which had this royal significance.
And in 1874, the British destroyed the Ashanti capital, took lots back to England. Much of it remains in the British Museum collection today.
And one of the objects, of course, that they really wanted to get their hands on was the golden stool. They first exiled Prempeh I, that was the Ashanti-hini, in the late 1800s.
The Ashanti people hid the golden stool.
The golden stool, which was obviously very important, in fact more sacred than Prempeh I himself, was in danger, and the British really tried hard to hunt it down.
The British governor said, and I'm reading here from a record of what happened. He said, "Where is the golden stool? I am the representative of the paramount power. Why have you relegated me to this ordinary chair? Why did you not take the opportunity of my coming to bring the golden stool for me to sit upon?"
This was so offensive to the people of Ghana that a foreigner would come and demand their most precious and sacred object to sit on. This is not a stool anyone was allowed to sit on. In fact, it sat on its own stool. So Ya Asantewa, a queen mother, assembled all the soldiers she could find to fight against the British.
Now, the Ashanti people were defeated, but the stool remained hidden.
The Ashanti were pretty successful in that they were allowed some autonomy, and by the 1920s, the British even agreed to allow Prempeh I to return, and there was a promise made that the golden stool would not be taken, and the golden stool was allowed to come out of hiding. Men and women are gifted stools by their parents when they come of age, and the idea of stools is really central not just to kingship, but to everyday people. And this brass weight in this case is a replica of what a man or woman would sit on, but made of wood. So a man and woman's everyday stool used for things like sitting and socializing, sitting and eating, sitting and working sounds very ordinary to us, but stools that one uses often take on their sunsum. Sunsum is a Ashanti concept, a traditional idea that your energy, it's like an aura that touches the things that you use a lot. So in order to keep your sunsum intact, when you leave the room, traditionally you would tip over your stool so that no one else would sit on it. They would know that that was not intended for you. In that sense, the golden stool is also kept turned on its side, as we see in this photograph.
So the gold weight tells us something about the importance of stools in the Shanti culture, but also about a personal energy that over the course of our lives, the objects that we use become imbued with.
That helps us to understand why the Ashanti people say the golden stool is the soul of the Ashanti nation.
Okay, so you can see that this particular work of art, how important it is to the Asante people. Like, it's not just a stool, it's symbolic of, this is your place. It's the heart of the people, and it even sits on its side. You'll notice it's not sitting up because it's not for you to sit on. It's not for anybody to sit on. So the British come in and start spoiling for a fight with the people of Ghana. And one of the ways to do that is by using the stool as an example, because they wanted to sit on the stool. They were insulted. They took it as a personal affront, which they knew was going to happen. And they attacked and looted Ghana. But fortunately, they hid the stool. Like the people hid it. The Ashanti king was gone. But at the same time, they preserved the stool and hid it until after World War I, and they were given basically independence, and then finally the stool came out of hiding. So something interesting to think about would be what other works of art could potentially have been worthy of starting a work of a war. I mean, think about this in Europe. I mean, yeah, during World War II, there were a lot of works of art that were destroyed, but a war wasn't started over it. But in a lot of these outside cultures, destroying something like this would be considered an act of war. And to these people, where it's much more than just a decoration to be hung in a home, it was worthy of starting this war of the golden stool. So finally, for this lecture, we're going to talk about the Yoruba people, who are nearby, also not Islamic, so kind of like the Benin, of southwestern Nigeria and nearby Benin. All right, so they were also ruled by a king who had divine rights. And he did have a palace that was built for him. It wasn't a massive palace, but during the 1800s, whenever this area was receiving a lot of visitors from other nations and tribes and outside Europe, or outside from Europe, this was a way for them to receive these visitors, kind of like Persepolis functioned as. And the king brought in Olowe of Isi. And Olowe of Isi was a renowned artist during this time. And one of the things I think is extremely notable is in Africa, in order to become an artist, you had to work your way up through a guild system. Like, you had to start as an apprentice and then work your way up to becoming a master and developing your own masterpieces and your own particular style. It was very, very strict standards because a lot of this artwork was done for royalty. So there had to be standards of how it was meant to look. And Olowe of Ise was very, very well known and celebrated for being an artist in a time where in Europe, artists still weren't getting this kind of credibility. They were seen in Europe as still kind of being, these drifting artists, whereas in Africa, this was a highly, highly esteemed position to get to be one of the people who could do this, because your main patrons were going to be royalty. And we can see what he did is created for this palace these veranda posts. Now, a veranda, if you look over here to the left in this small picture, is a porch that extends out. And these statues that you're looking at right here, carved out of wood, were the veranda posts that held up that. And all of them were symbolic in a way that would send messages to visitors coming to this palace. And hierarchy of scale is going to be one of those. And you can see here in this particular one for the 250 that the woman in the back is significantly higher than the man who is sitting in front of her, and that is the king. But you'll notice that it's an even bigger deal for the woman standing there supporting him. So just a couple things that you can tell make this that it's identifiable as being Olowe of Ise. Olowe of Ise was very good at working in the round where it was meant to be seen from all angles. Like he wasn't happy with something just being seen from the front, which is why his works of art work so well for these veranda posts, because you would walk in and then walk around behind them and see them. To him, the negative space was just as important as the positive space. His works have a lot of negative space and works that like pieces that project out and come into the artist space. It's not just there meant to be looked at. It's very dynamic. There's movement through the lines that run through it. Like, for example, here we have the Benin king that his crown points upwards to the bird, but then the lines also point backwards to her as kind of a reminder of her importance in all of this. So another thing that and this was, I mean, pretty impressive during this time, and his artwork is actually going to be highly influential on artists of Europe who are going to really like this style of having an idea represented with only what is necessary. So if you'll notice, he has a lot of intricate detail, but nothing is superfluous. Everything that is there is meant to be there. Like none of it is just strictly decorative. It all has a purpose. And there's going to be a lot of European artists who are going to think, wow, I could really strip down my works of art into just what is necessary to convey a message. All right, so this particular work of art has so many details to it that I don't want to forget anything. So I'm going to add some in, but I'm going to rely also on the experts because there is so much symbolism included in this particular artwork.
We're in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in their galleries devoted to the art of Africa, looking at this large sculpture, which was originally a veranda post. That is, it was this vertical sculpture originally intended to be among the structural posts of a palace porch.
This was created for a palace among the Yoruba in Nigeria by a well-known artist named Olowe of Ise. And Ise is a region in southwestern Nigeria where this artist came from.
There are numerous royal objects that this artist produced. This particular sculpture at the Met shows a mounted figure holding the attributes of a warrior, or perhaps a warrior king. Let's refer to him as a king, since he represents military power, the power of the enthroned king and his rule.
Horses were introduced into this region, the Sahel, into the Yoruba, sometime in the 10th century.
In his left hand, the king holds a spear, this traditional instrument.
Okay, so that wasn't the right one. I put the wrong video in, and I'm sorry about that, but I think I can do this enough in my own, and if I don't, then I'll go back and add stuff into it. So, first of all, this is called the veranda post of enthroned king and senior wife, all right? So if you look here, you'll notice that she is actually the bigger person here. She stands towering over him. And the message from this, and one thing is very unique about Africa, is that they are more matrilineal than they are patrilineal, that they trace their royal lineage back through their mothers, not through their fathers. It's not their father's name that is as important, it's their mother's, all right? So here you see that he has the crown on his head, right? And this is that beaded crown from a legend that the first king of Ife gave crowns like this ones to his sons. So basically saying that like he is a descendant of one of these original kings. And you have the faces on the crown that face all of these different directions, like kind of all seeing, like having to be all wise. And then you'll notice that at the top of it, your eyes draw you up to the bird. And birds are considered to be kind of like this connection between this world and the next world. So kind of like messengers, if you will, or kind of like their ability to connect with ancestors because the birds can fly. They can be on land and in the air. But let's talk about this woman for a second. All right. She has eyes that are kind of bulging out. And that's not because she naturally looked like that. It's because it gave her almost this sight, this knowledge and understanding. And this incredible woman, who also is large-breasted, because those protruding would show that there's fertility. So like kind of showing that there will be prosperity in this rule. And she is supporting him. Like he is sitting on a throne, but she is supporting him. Like she has put the crown on his head, that it gives him more power because she did this, kind of like coming from this matrilineal line, like this female descendant, and that his rule will be fruitful, and that he is served well by this woman who supports him, this senior wife who has the ability to see everything into this world and the next world. And because of that, that actually solidified his power even more, because she is supporting him and he is smaller than her. Now, just to show you, this is kind of interesting. This is in Europe. This is by Constantin Brancusi, and he was actually inspired by the veranda post. So if you look here, you'll notice that it's got a whole lot of textures in it, and it's very moving and changing, kind of guiding your eye through it. And he was really inspired by Olowe of EC and the veranda post, that basically EC had stripped down anything that wasn't necessary. It was gone, and just used what was necessary with great detail to tell an idea, that it wasn't necessary to have naturalism, or in this case, even anything that looks like anything, just to convey a particular idea instead. All right, so we're going to stop there, and then we're going to move into, so we've been on kind of West Africa. Now we're going to move into the Congo, where the heart of Africa is where some of the worst abuses of African people during the age of imperialism took place.